The newest sequel to one of the most popular and cultivating horror films of all time, The Exorcist, has a brand new legacy sequel that is hitting theaters tomorrow. And now that I have seen this film, well, this is going to be a pretty angry Brad review. Welcome back, film fans. It is Brad from Let's Be Real Brad, and today on the channel, I want to talk to you guys about the brand new horror film called The Exorcist Believer. The Exorcist Believer is co-written and directed by David Gordon Green, who you may know who directed the newest Halloween trilogy from Blumhouse, and now Blumhouse is producing the newest The Exorcist trilogy that is coming out. So they had David Gordon Green direct this film, and now that we have this new set of films, I'm really not excited to see what we have in store. This is one of those films that I was sort of excited for because the trailer for this movie actually looked pretty decent as it played before Oppenheimer, and no one else had seen the trailer yet, and people in my audience were actually pretty excited for it. You could hear all the little bit of chatter and laughter and just people really excited for that movie. But when the reviews came out earlier this week on Rotten Tomatoes and it just kept dropping, I knew that this movie wasn't going to be all good. So as you know, I try to go into every movie with an open mind, and this movie just did not do it for me. For people who are big fans of the Exorcist films, you are going to be very, very disappointed in this movie. Not in the way that this movie is just bad, but in terms of some of the decisions that this movie makes that I just feel are so unnecessary and just don't really make a lot of sense. So let's just dive into some of my negatives I do have with this film, and I do have to start with the story. This could have been such an interesting story, as the beginning of this film actually isn't spoiled in the trailer whatsoever. So it is very different from all the other Exorcist films, and it reminded me very heavily of that 2013 movie Prisoners by Denis Villeneuve, and I was actually pretty into the movie. But once you get to that point that you have seen most of the best footage from the trailer in the film, that is when the movie just starts to fall apart, when the girls become possessed. Because the film feels so choppy and all over the place, with so many random little storylines and random tiny moments that happen throughout the film that doesn't feel like it cohesively comes together, and it's just a massive mess of a film. One of the biggest issues with the story is that I just became so uninterested in it that I honestly just wanted the movie to end. The movie clocks in around 2 hours, and I felt like the story just didn't go anywhere. This movie attempts to go back to the past and add a legacy character like Ellen Burstyn from the original film in this movie, but her character literally does nothing in this movie, and the way that they handled this character was so poorly done that it honestly really made me mad, because it was so pointless and unnecessary, and it was just a slap in the face to the Exorcist fans. I genuinely feel bad for Ellen Burstyn being in this film. One of the most disappointing aspects about this film has to be with the horror, as this is one of the most non-scary films I have seen this year, as I didn't feel an ounce of being on edge the entire time. This movie doesn't even try to do a lot of your typical mainstream jump scares, as there's like 2 or 3, but this movie is trying to be like that original Exorcist film, where it doesn't have to rely on jump scares, and it's all about the disturbing, horrific sequences that you're watching that just sits with you. That's the type of horror that I love. I think that's some of the best. But this movie doesn't really do that. So this movie is just a massive slugfest of a film that you don't really feel anything while watching until you get to the third act of the film, where you get your typical exorcism type scene, which is one of the better scenes in the film, but I just didn't feel anything while watching it. But this all comes to David Gordon Green, who is the co-writer and director of the film, and I just don't feel as though that he does a great job with the presentation of the movie, because I just didn't feel anything while watching this movie. I wanted to be invested in the characters. I actually think that the father and daughter dynamic in this movie is actually pretty decent in the beginning, but then it just falls apart and you don't really feel anything. I mean, the performances in this movie are decent. I think that David Gordon Green is able to get good performances out of everybody. I mean, Leslie Odom Jr. is already a very talented actor, and Dowd is very talented as well, but everything else in this movie is just very tame and lax, considering that this is a rated R film, and it really doesn't feel that way at all. Speaking of the pacing, this is easily one of the most boring films I have watched this entire year, as this movie was just so slowly paced, and by the time you get to the exorcism scene, there's about 45 minutes left of the film, and it just feels so excessively long, especially when you finally get to like the end of the film. It just keeps going. It becomes very preachy and unnecessary, and I just wanted this movie to end because it doesn't feel like anybody making this film actually cared about The Exorcist and why it made it good. This movie is technically a sequel, like all of the other Exorcist sequels are like their own sequel to the original film, but this honestly should have just been a pure remake because it doesn't really have any connection to that original film, and some of the things that they change in this movie doesn't align with that first movie, and it just doesn't make any sense. And as an Exorcist fan, it's gonna make you pretty mad. I also found this was one of the most poorly edited films I have seen this year, where there is just an amazing amount of cuts in this film that are just so stagnantly just choppy and weird, and it just feels so uncomfortable, like not in like a I'm uncomfortable, like feeling excited kind of way, just it was just bad and weird, especially in the final exorcism scene, where it just cuts to all these characters who don't actually look scared, and they look like they're just looking at nothing. And so when it's all put together, it just looks like a complete mess, especially in the middle of the film when the movie is trying to scare you. It feels like there was so much of this movie that was cut out and they had to just play around with what they had, because there is just random shots in this movie that don't really make sense. There are characters that like will just show up and weren't introduced into the scene. It feels like there was a whole scene of that character being introduced. It's just like little things like that that made this experience really hard to get through, especially of many of the shots in this movie are extremely boring. There are a few shots here and there that are kind of decent, but in terms of the dialogue scenes, it is just so boring to watch, where it's just, you know, shot A, shot B, shot A, shot B, back and forth without any emotion or feel behind it. I also thought that the score for this film was not that great and very manipulative, especially again in the final exorcism scene. There's a moment where it's like, oh yay, this is our shine of hope, and the music is so overbearing and annoying, and when I rewatched the first Exorcist, and when I watched the original Exorcist film from 1973, I realized there is not a lot of score in that film. It's actually pretty quiet, and it's made that movie so much more disturbing, where in this film, the score is just so annoying, especially when there is a jump scare. It just goes blah, especially in the Dolby Atmos. Surprisingly, with all the negatives I do have a few positives with this film, and I sort of mentioned it already, but Leslie Odom Jr. is actually pretty decent in this movie, and I do feel that his talent is wasted because he is really, really talented. Like, if you've seen Hamilton, you know how good this guy is. And this is a different type of performance we've seen from him, being more of a dad type role in a more serious film. And I actually thought he did a really great job here, as well as Dowd. If you've seen that film Mass from a couple years ago, she was excellent. And Ellen Burstyn is great in everything she is in, even if her performance was sort of wasted in this film. And the last positive that I could somehow give this film is that there are moments that are sprinkled throughout the film, just moments here and there that you just see signs of promise, where you could see a good movie in here. And I just would love to see a director's cut in the future, or just fix this film up, because there are just certain moments that aren't amazing by any means, but could be fixed if you had the right person putting this movie together, having better producers, maybe a better director, because this whole movie just feels like a complete and utter mess. Overall, guys, The Exorcist Believer is a really bad horror film, especially a sequel to one of the most iconic horror films of all time. It doesn't do anything to really add to the franchise. It just feels so old and just cliched and just filled with so much more of the crappy mainstream tropes that you would see in a typical horror film. It is so badly paced and so annoying to watch that I honestly would never want to rewatch this movie again if they still decide to do The Exorcist Deceiver, which should be coming out in 2025. This movie is a massive waste of time seeing, and I would completely skip it. I am giving The Exorcist Believer a 4 out of 10. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. As I want to know below in the comment section, have you seen The Exorcist Believer, and where would you rank it among the other Exorcist films? I would really love to hear it. Before you guys check out this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a like as you always should, and ring that notification bell so you never get to miss a brand new video.